The morning sun barely broke through the gray clouds hanging over the palace grounds. Inside the grand estate, a silence had settled that felt heavier than any stone. Prince Alexander stood by the tall window of his private chamber, his hands clasped behind his back, staring out at nothing in particular. His usual composed demeanor had cracked, revealing a man struggling to hold himself together. Princess Catherine sat in the adjoining room, her face pale and eyes red from crying. She held a small photograph in her trembling hands, one taken just 3 months ago when everything seemed perfect. The image showed 3 people laughing together, their faces bright with joy. Now one of those faces would never smile again. The palace staff moved quietly through the corridors, speaking in whispers. Everyone knew what had happened. The Queen Mother, beloved by the entire nation, had passed away suddenly 2 days ago. She had been the pillar of the royal family, the gentle force that held them all together through scandals, celebrations, and everything in between. Her unexpected death from a heart attack had sent shockwaves not just through the palace, but across the entire country. Alexander and Catherine had received the news while attending a charity event in another city. The phone call came during dinner. Alexander's private secretary approached him discreetly, leaning down to whisper something in his ear. Catherine watched as all color drained from her husband's face. He stood up so abruptly that his chair fell backward. Without a word to anyone, he grabbed Catherine's hand and rushed out of the venue. The drive back to the palace took 3 hours, but it felt like 3 days. Alexander sat rigid in the back seat, his jaw clenched, refusing to speak. Catherine held his hand, feeling it grow colder with each passing mile. She wanted to say something comforting, but what words could possibly ease this pain? The Queen Mother had been more than just Alexander's grandmother. She had raised him after his own mother died when he was just 7 years old. When they finally arrived at the palace, it was past midnight. The building was lit up completely, every window glowing against the dark sky. Staff members lined the entrance, their heads bowed in respect. As Alexander stepped out of the car, his legs nearly gave way beneath him. Catherine caught his arm, steadying him. Together they walked through the massive doors into a world that had changed forever. The Queen Mother's personal physician met them in the main hall. Dr. Morrison was an elderly man who had served the royal family for 40 years. His eyes were moist as he explained what had happened. The Queen Mother had been in her garden that afternoon, tending to her roses as she did every day. She loved those roses more than any crown jewel. A maid heard a soft cry and rushed outside to find her collapsed among the flower beds. Everything possible was done. The medical team arrived within minutes. They tried to revive her, working frantically for over an hour, but her heart had simply given out. She was 82 years old, but until that moment she had seemed ageless, full of energy and life. The doctor's voice broke as he finished his explanation. Alexander stood frozen, unable to process the words. Catherine thanked the doctor quietly, her own voice shaking. That night neither of them slept. They sat together in the Queen Mother's favorite sitting room, surrounded by her belongings. Her reading glasses rested on a side table, next to a book she would never finish. Her embroidery lay in a basket, the needle still threaded. The room smelled of her lavender perfume, and for a moment, Catherine almost expected her to walk through the door, smiling and asking if they wanted tea. Alexander finally broke down around 4 in the morning. He had been holding everything inside, trying to be strong, trying to be the prince everyone expected him to be, but sitting in that room surrounded by memories, he could not maintain the facade any longer. He buried his face in his hands and wept like a child. Catherine moved closer, wrapping her arms around him, letting him release all the grief he had been containing. The news of the Queen Mother's death had already spread across the nation by sunrise. Television channels interrupted their regular programming to announce the tragedy. Radio stations played somber music. Social media exploded with messages of condolence and shared memories. The Queen Mother had been deeply loved by the public. She had dedicated her entire life to charitable causes, visiting hospitals, schools, and community centers. She knew the names of ordinary citizens and asked about their families. She was the rare royal who made people feel seen and valued. Outside the palace gates, people began to gather even before dawn. They came in small groups at first, then in crowds carrying flowers, candles, and photographs of the Queen Mother. They stood in silence, some crying openly, others simply staring at the palace as if they could not believe what had happened. By noon, Thousands had assembled, creating a sea of mourning humanity that stretched for blocks. Inside the palace, preparations began for the formal announcement and the funeral arrangements. Alexander had to meet with advisors, sign documents, and make decisions about protocols he wished he never had to consider. Catherine stayed by his side through every meeting, providing silent support. She answered questions when he could not find his voice, squeezed his hand when she saw him struggling, and reminded him to breathe when the weight of responsibility threatened to crush him. The Prime Minister arrived in the afternoon to offer his condolences and discuss the state funeral arrangements. The Queen Mother would receive full honors, he explained, befitting her decades of service to the nation. Alexander nodded mechanically, agreeing to everything. He did not care about ceremonies or protocols. He just wanted his grandmother back. As evening approached, palace officials informed them that the public was demanding to see them. Thousands of people stood outside, grieving alongside the royal family, wanting some connection, some acknowledgement of their shared loss. The communications director suggested a brief appearance on the palace balcony. Alexander initially refused. He could not imagine facing crowds, cameras, and expectations. But Catherine gently convinced him. These people loved his grandmother too, she reminded him. They needed to mourn together. The palace staff helped them prepare for the public appearance. Catherine changed into a simple black dress and Alexander wore a dark suit. As they walked toward the balcony doors, Catherine could feel Alexander's hand shaking in hers. She paused, turning to face him fully. His eyes were red and swollen, his face drawn with exhaustion and grief. She reached up and gently touched his cheek. "They need to see that we are human too," she whispered. "They need to know it is okay to cry." Alexander closed his eyes and leaned into her touch for a moment, gathering whatever strength he had left. Then together they pushed open the doors and stepped onto the balcony. The sound hit them immediately. It was not cheering or applause. It was something Catherine had never heard before, a collective sob from thousands of throats. The massive crowd below fell into a deeper hush as the royal couple appeared. Every face was turned upward, every eye filled with tears. People held candles that flickered in the growing darkness, creating an ocean of small lights that stretched as far as they could see. Alexander stepped forward to the balcony railing. For a long moment he simply stood there, looking out at his people. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His throat tightened. His vision blurred with tears. He had prepared a statement, something formal and appropriate, but now every carefully chosen word vanished from his mind. Catherine saw him struggling. She moved to stand beside him, taking his hand in full view of everyone. The cameras captured every moment, the flash of photographs creating bursts of light in the dusk. She did not try to take over or save him. She just stood there, showing everyone that he was not alone in his pain. Then something unexpected happened. From somewhere in the crowd, a single voice began to sing. It was the national anthem, but sung slowly, mournfully, like a lullaby for the departed. Within seconds, others joined in. The song spread through the masses like a wave, thousands of voices uniting in tribute. It was not a celebration, but a farewell, a final gift to the Queen Mother who had given them so much. Alexander's composure finally shattered. Tears streamed down his face as he listened to his people sing. He made no attempt to hide them or wipe them away. He simply stood there openly weeping, and the crowd loved him even more for it. They saw not a prince but a grandson who had lost someone precious. They saw their own grief reflected in his tears. When the anthem ended, silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. Alexander cleared his throat and managed to speak, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you," he said simply. Those two words carried everything. "Thank you for loving her. Thank you for being here. Thank you for understanding." The crowd responded with a gentle murmur of sympathy, a sound like wind through trees. Catherine felt tears sliding down her own face. She had loved the Queen Mother dearly. The older woman had welcomed her into the family with open arms when she and Alexander married 5 years ago. While others in the royal circle had been judgmental and cold, treating Catherine like an outsider because she came from a common background, the Queen Mother had been different. She told Catherine that love mattered more than lineage, that character mattered more than breeding. The Queen Mother had taught Catherine how to navigate the impossible world of royal life. She showed her which forks to use at formal dinners, how to curtsy properly, how to smile through exhausting public appearances. But more importantly, she taught her how to stay true to herself despite all the pressure to conform. Be kind but not weak, the Queen Mother often said. Be gracious but not false. Remember who you are underneath the titles. Now that wise, loving voice was gone forever. Catherine would never again sit with her in the garden, listening to stories about the old days. They would never share afternoon tea, discussing everything from politics to poetry. There would be no more late-night conversations when Catherine felt overwhelmed, when the Queen Mother would hold her hand and remind her that she was stronger than she knew. After several minutes on the balcony, palace officials indicated it was time to go back inside. Alexander nodded slowly. Before turning away, he raised his hand in a small wave to the crowd. It was a gesture of connection, of shared humanity. The people below responded by raising their candles higher, creating a surge of light in the darkness. Then the royal couple stepped back through the doors, leaving the public to their vigil. Back inside the palace, Alexander collapsed into a chair. His brief moment of strength had cost him everything he had left. Catherine knelt beside him, taking his hands in hers. He looked at her with such profound sadness that it broke her heart all over again. How am I supposed to do this without her? He whispered. She was my compass. She kept me grounded. What do I do now? Catherine had no easy answers. She was struggling with her own grief, her own sense of loss. But she knew Alexander needed something to hold on to. You do what she taught you, Catherine said softly. You lead with compassion. You serve with humility. You love without reservation. She is still with you, Alexander. Everything she gave you, all her wisdom and kindness that lives in you now. The days that followed were a blur of preparations and ceremonies. The Queen Mother's body was moved to the palace chapel, where she would lie in state for 3 days, allowing the public to pay their respects. The line of mourners stretched for miles. People waited for hours in the cold, just for a chance to walk past her casket and say goodbye. They brought mountains of flowers, so many that the palace staff had to designate entire rooms just to store them. Alexander and Catherine took turns standing vigil by the casket. Royal protocol did not require it, but they wanted to be there. They wanted to honor her in every way possible. During his shifts, Alexander would stand perfectly still, his face a mask of controlled grief. But sometimes, late at night when fewer people were around, Catherine would see him lean close to the casket and whisper things no one else could hear. Catherine found her own moments to grieve privately. One afternoon, she returned to the Queen Mother's sitting room. Everything remained exactly as it had been. Palace staff had been instructed not to touch anything until after the funeral. Catherine sat in the Queen Mother's favorite chair, the one by the window where she used to read every morning. She picked up the unfinished book from the side table and opened it to the marked page. The Queen Mother had been reading a mystery novel, one of her favorite genres. Catherine read the last few paragraphs that those beloved eyes had seen. Somehow it made her feel closer to the woman she missed so desperately. She closed the book carefully and pressed it to her chest, letting herself cry without restraint for the first time since that horrible night. Messages of condolence poured in from around the world. Presidents, prime ministers, and royalty from other nations sent formal letters and telegrams. But the messages that touched Alexander and Catherine most deeply came from ordinary people. Children sent drawings of the Queen Mother surrounded by flowers. Elderly citizens shared memories of meeting her decades ago, describing how she had remembered their names and asked about their lives. One woman wrote about how the Queen Mother had visited her son in the hospital 20 years ago and stayed to read him stories. That son was now a doctor himself, inspired by that single act of kindness. Catherine read many of these letters aloud to Alexander in the evenings. They sat together in their private quarters, sharing stories about the woman who had meant so much to so many. Sometimes they laughed, remembering her terrible jokes and her stubborn insistence on doing things her own way. The Queen Mother had refused to use a mobile phone, claiming she was too old to learn new tricks. She had insisted on writing letters by hand, even though it took much longer. She had a mischievous sense of humor that surprised people who expected royalty to be stuffy and formal. One letter in particular made them both cry and smile at the same time. It came from a schoolteacher who explained that the Queen Mother had anonymously funded scholarships for children from poor families for over 30 years. She had done it quietly, never seeking recognition or praise. The teacher only discovered the truth after the Queen Mother's death, when the palace confirmed the source of the funding. Dozens of children had received educations they otherwise could never have afforded, all because of her generosity. How many other secret kindnesses had she performed that no one would ever know about? The night before the funeral, Alexander could not sleep. He got out of bed around 2 a.m. and wandered through the palace halls. His feet carried him without conscious thought to the chapel where his grandmother lay. The guards at the door bowed respectfully but said nothing as he entered. The chapel was dimly lit by candles. The Queen Mother's casket sat elevated on a platform, covered in the royal standard. Alexander approached slowly, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. He stood beside the casket and placed his hand on the smooth wood. For a long time, he simply stood there in silence, trying to accept the reality that she was truly gone. "I am not ready," he finally whispered into the darkness. "I am not ready to say goodbye. I am not ready to be the person everyone needs me to be without you here to guide me. What if I fail? What if I make terrible decisions? What if I cannot be half the leader you were?" Of course, there was no answer. The silence pressed in around him, heavy and complete. But as he stood there, a memory surfaced. He was 10 years old, terrified to give his first public speech. The Queen Mother had found him hiding in a closet, trembling with anxiety. She had sat beside him on the floor, not caring about her expensive dress or proper royal behavior. She had taken his small hands in her wrinkled ones and told him something he never forgot. "Being brave does not mean not being scared," she had said. "Being brave means doing what needs to be done even when you are terrified. And you will make mistakes, Alexander. You will stumble and fall. But what matters is that you get back up, you learn, and you keep trying. That is all anyone can ask of themselves." Standing in the chapel, remembering those words, Alexander felt something shift inside him. The fear did not disappear, but it became bearable. She had prepared him for this moment his entire life. Every lesson, every conversation, every example she set had been building toward the day when he would have to carry on without her physical presence. The real question was not whether he could do it, but whether he would honor her memory by trying his absolute best. He leaned down and kissed the casket gently. "Goodbye, grandmother," he whispered. "Thank you for everything. I will make you proud. I promise." Then he turned and walked out of the chapel, his shoulders a little straighter, his resolve a little stronger. The morning of the funeral arrived cold and gray. The entire nation seemed to pause. Businesses closed. Schools shut down. People gathered in their homes, in churches and public squares to watch the ceremony on television. It would be the largest state funeral in a generation, attended by dignitaries from 50 countries. Catherine helped Alexander dress in his formal military uniform. His hands shook as he tried to fasten the buttons. She took over, her fingers steady despite her own emotional turmoil. When she finished, she stepped back to look at him. He looked older somehow, the grief having aged him in just a few days. But there was something else in his eyes now, a determination that had not been there before. "We can do this," she said quietly. "Together." Alexander pulled her close, holding her tightly. "What would I do without you?" he murmured into her hair. "You are my strength." Catherine closed her eyes, drawing comfort from his embrace even as she tried to provide it. They stood like that for several minutes, two people holding each other up, preparing to face the hardest day of their lives. The funeral procession began at 10 o'clock. The Queen Mother's casket was placed on a horse-drawn carriage, the same one used for royal funerals for over 100 years. 6 black horses pulled it slowly through the palace gates and into the streets. Behind it walked Alexander and Catherine, along with other members of the royal family. They walked for 2 miles through the capital city, all the way to the cathedral. The streets were lined with people, hundreds of thousands of them, standing in absolute silence as the procession passed. Catherine had never experienced anything like it. The only sounds were the horses' hooves on the pavement, the creak of the carriage wheels, and the quiet sobbing of mourners. Every person along the route held flowers or candles. Many held photographs of the Queen Mother. Some held signs with simple messages. "Thank you," "We love you," "Rest peacefully." Alexander kept his eyes forward, his face expressionless. He had put on his royal mask, the one he wore when duty demanded he set aside personal feelings. But Catherine walked slightly behind him and could see his jaw clenching, the tension in his shoulders. She knew he was using every ounce of willpower to maintain his composure. Halfway through the route, Something happened that nearly broke through Alexander's carefully maintained control. An elderly man stepped forward from the crowd holding a single red rose. Security moved to stop him, but Alexander raised his hand, signaling them to let the man approach. The old man, probably in his 90s, shuffled forward with tears streaming down his weathered face. "She saved my life," the old man said, his voice cracking. 60 years ago, when I was a young soldier wounded in battle, she visited the military hospital. She sat by my bed and held my hand when I had no family to comfort me. I never forgot her kindness." Alexander took the rose from the man's trembling hand and held it carefully. "Thank you for telling me," he said softly. "She would have remembered you too. She never forgot anyone she met." The old soldier saluted, his hand shaking but his spine straight. Alexander returned the salute with military precision. Then the procession moved on, Alexander now carrying that single rose along with the weight of his grief. Catherine saw his mask slip for just a moment, saw the raw emotion flash across his face before he controlled it again. Her heart ached for him, but there was nothing she could do except continue walking beside him, a silent presence of support. When they finally reached the cathedral, the massive bells were tolling slowly, their deep sound rolling across the city. The cathedral could hold 2,000 people and every seat was filled. World leaders sat beside community volunteers. Wealthy aristocrats sat next to ordinary citizens who had won a lottery for public seats. In death, the Queen Mother brought together all levels of society, just as she had tried to do in life. The service was both magnificent and deeply personal. A renowned soprano sang hymns that had been the Queen Mother's favorites. The Archbishop gave a sermon about service, sacrifice, and love. But the moment that touched everyone most deeply came when Alexander himself rose to give the eulogy. He walked to the pulpit slowly, carrying papers that contained his prepared speech. But when he reached the front and looked out at all those faces, all those people who had loved his grandmother, he set the papers aside. He would speak from his heart instead. "My grandmother taught me that titles mean nothing without character," he began, his voice strong despite the tears threatening to fall. "She wore a crown, but she was most proud of her calloused hands from working in her garden. She lived in a palace, but her favorite place was a children's hospital, where she volunteered every week for 40 years. She was called Your Majesty, but she asked the janitors and gardeners to call her by her first name." His voice caught, and he paused to collect himself. Catherine sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly together, willing him strength. Alexander cleared his throat and continued. "She raised me after my mother died. She could have handed me over to nannies and tutors, but instead, she was there for every scraped knee, every bad dream. Every moment I needed someone to love me unconditionally. She taught me to read by acting out stories with funny voices. She taught me about responsibility by letting me help her with her charity work. She taught me about courage by showing me her own. Every single day." Alexander's voice grew stronger as he spoke, the words flowing more easily. "Many people say she was a saint, but she would hate that. She was not perfect, and she never claimed to be. She had a terrible temper when people were cruel or unjust. She could be stubborn as a mule when she believed she was right. She absolutely refused to learn how to use a computer no matter how many times I tried to teach her." Gentle laughter rippled through the cathedral, a welcome moment of lightness in the heavy sorrow. Alexander smiled through his tears. "But she loved completely, fiercely, and without conditions. She saw the good in everyone and helped them see it in themselves. She made people feel valued and important, no matter who they were or where they came from. And she taught me that true royalty is not about power or privilege. It is about service. It is about using whatever resources you have to make the world a little better, a little kinder, a little more just." He looked directly at Catherine then, his eyes locking with hers. "She taught me about real love too. She told me that the right partner is not someone who completes you, but someone who inspires you to complete yourself, someone who stands beside you in the storms and celebrates with you in the sunshine. I found that person, and my grandmother welcomed her into our family with open arms and an open heart." Catherine felt tears spilling down her cheeks. Alexander turned back to address the entire congregation. "I am not ready to say goodbye. I do not think I will ever be ready. But I know she would not want us to stay frozen in grief. She would want us to honor her memory by living as she taught us, with kindness, with generosity, with courage, with love." He paused, looking up at the soaring cathedral ceiling as if he could see beyond it to wherever his grandmother's spirit had gone. So I make this promise not just to her memory but to all of you. I will try every day to be the man she believed I could be. I will fail sometimes because I am human and flawed, but I will keep trying. I will serve this nation and its people with every breath in my body. I will honor her legacy by living a life of meaning and purpose. The cathedral was completely silent except for the sound of quiet weeping. Alexander's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow everyone could hear him. I love you, grandmother. Thank you for everything. Rest now. You have earned your peace. We will carry on from here. He stepped away from the pulpit and returned to his seat beside Catherine. The moment he sat down, she took his hand and held it tightly. He gripped hers in return, and they sat like that through the rest of the service, connected and united in their grief. After the cathedral service, a smaller group traveled to the royal cemetery for the private burial. Only close family and a few longtime staff members attended this final farewell. The Queen Mother would be laid to rest beside her late husband, who had died 20 years earlier. Alexander had been told she spoke to her husband every day, visiting his grave and telling him about her life, her work, and her family. Now they would be together again. Alexander found some small comfort in that thought. The private ceremony was brief. A minister said a few words, but mostly there was just silence and the sound of the wind in the trees. When it came time to lower the casket into the ground, Alexander stepped forward with a handful of earth. He let it fall onto the casket, the sound seeming impossibly loud in the quiet cemetery. Catherine followed, adding her own handful of earth. Then other family members did the same, each saying their private goodbyes. When everyone had finished, they stood together in a small circle around the grave. Nobody wanted to leave. To walk away felt like abandoning her, even though they all knew that was foolish. This was just her body. Her spirit, her love, her influence lived on in all of them. Finally, as the sun began to set, they slowly made their way back to the cars. Alexander was the last to leave. He stood at the grave alone for several minutes, having one final silent conversation with the woman who had shaped his entire life. Then he touched his fingers to his lips and pressed them against the cold headstone. Goodbye, he whispered one last time. Then he turned and walked away, each step feeling heavier than the last. That evening, back at the palace, there was a small private gathering. It was not a celebration, but rather a sharing of memories. Close friends and family sat together in the Queen Mother's favorite room, telling stories and remembering the woman they all loved. Someone recalled her terrible singing voice and how she sang loudly anyway. Another person remembered her competitive nature during card games and how she hated to lose. A cousin shared about the time she got lost in the palace gardens, and the Queen Mother organized a search party, only to find her asleep under a rose bush. The stories flowed for hours, each one bringing both tears and laughter. Alexander participated quietly, adding his own memories when moved to do so. He talked about how she used to sneak him cookies before dinner when he was a child, swearing him to secrecy from the palace cooks. He remembered how she attended every one of his school plays, even the terrible ones where he forgot his lines. She had been there for his first day of university, his graduation, his military training, and his wedding day. Catherine shared her own favorite memory. Shortly after she and Alexander married, the Queen Mother had invited her for a private lunch in the garden. Catherine had been terrified, convinced she would do something wrong or say something inappropriate. But the Queen Mother had immediately put her at ease. She told Catherine about her own experience marrying into the royal family as a young woman, how frightened and overwhelmed she had felt. She explained that everyone makes mistakes and that grace comes from how you handle them, not from never making them at all. That conversation changed everything for me, Catherine said, her voice thick with emotion. She made me understand that I did not have to be perfect. I just had to be genuine. She gave me permission to be myself, even in a world that constantly tried to mold me into someone else. I will never forget that gift. As the evening wore on and people began to leave, Alexander and Catherine finally found themselves alone. They sat together on the sofa where the Queen Mother used to sit every afternoon with her tea. The room still smelled faintly of her perfume, and her presence seemed to linger in every corner. Catherine rested her head on Alexander's shoulder and he wrapped his arm around her. How do we move forward from here? Catherine asked quietly. How do we wake up tomorrow and the next day and the day after that? knowing she is gone? Alexander was silent for a long moment, considering the question. I think we take it one day at a time, he finally said. Some days will be harder than others. Some days the grief will feel unbearable. But we have each other, and we have the lessons she taught us. We have a purpose and a duty. And we have love. That will have to be enough. Catherine nodded against his shoulder. She is proud of you, you know. The way you spoke today, the strength you showed. She would be so proud. Alexander felt fresh tears burning behind his eyes. I hope so, he whispered. I really hope so. The weeks following the funeral were difficult in ways Alexander had not anticipated. The initial shock and the busy preparations had kept him moving, functioning. But now, in the quiet aftermath, the full weight of his loss crashed down on him. There were moments when he would forget she was gone. He would think of something he wanted to tell her or ask her advice about, and he would actually begin walking toward her rooms before remembering. Each time it happened, the pain felt fresh and sharp all over again. Catherine watched him struggle and did her best to support him. She learned to recognize the signs when he was having a particularly hard day. She would find him staring out windows lost in memories, or she would wake in the night to find his side of the bed empty and discover him in his study, surrounded by photographs of his grandmother. She never pushed him to talk or pressured him to be okay. She simply stayed close, a constant presence reminding him he was not alone. The palace felt different without the Queen Mother. Her absence was a physical thing, a void that could not be filled. Staff members walked quietly past her rooms, which remained exactly as she had left them. Alexander could not bring himself to change anything or give away her belongings. It felt too final, too much like erasing her from existence. So her rooms became a kind of shrine, preserved perfectly, waiting for someone who would never return. Alexander threw himself into his royal duties with an intensity that worried Catherine. He took on more charity work, more public appearances, more responsibilities. He was trying to outrun his grief, she realized. He believed that if he stayed busy enough, productive enough, maybe the pain would dull. But grief does not work that way. It waits patiently for quiet moments and empty spaces. It demands to be felt, no matter how much we try to avoid it. One evening, about 6 weeks after the funeral, Catherine found Alexander in the Queen Mother's garden. He was standing among the roses, the ones she had loved and tended for decades. The garden had become neglected in her absence. The head gardener had asked for instructions on maintaining it, but Alexander had not been able to make any decisions about it. Now weeds were beginning to invade, and some of the roses looked stressed and overgrown. Alexander stood in the middle of the garden, looking lost and overwhelmed. Catherine approached quietly and stood beside him. "It is a mess," he said dully. She would be heartbroken to see it like this. But I do not know what to do. I do not know which plants need to be pruned or how to care for them properly. She knew all of that. She could spend hours out here, and somehow it never felt like work to her. Catherine took his hand gently. "Then let us learn," she said. "We can ask the gardeners to teach us. We can take care of her roses the way she did. It will take time and effort, but we can do it together. It can be a way to honor her memory, to keep this part of her alive." Alexander looked at her, and for the first time in weeks, something like hope flickered in his eyes. "You would do that?" he asked. "Spend hours learning about gardening just to help me preserve her garden?" Catherine smiled softly. "Of course I would. I loved her too, and I love you. We are in this together, remember? Always together." The next day they met with the head gardener. He was an elderly man named Thomas who had worked with the Queen Mother for over 30 years. His eyes were still red from crying whenever he spoke about her. He was honored and touched that the prince and princess wanted to learn to care for her garden themselves. He promised to teach them everything he knew, so began a new routine. Every morning before breakfast, Alexander and Catherine would spend an hour in the garden with Thomas. He taught them about soil pH and proper pruning techniques. He showed them how to deadhead spent blooms and how to watch for signs of disease or pests. He explained the Queen Mother's philosophy of gardening, how she believed that plants responded to love and attention just like people did. Working in the garden became therapeutic for Alexander. There was something healing about putting his hands in the dirt, about nurturing living things, about seeing tangible results from his efforts. The garden could not replace his grandmother, but caring for it made him feel connected to her. Sometimes while working, he would remember her standing in that exact spot, her hands dirty and her face peaceful, Those memories brought both sadness and comfort. Catherine found her own healing in the garden as well. She had always admired the Queen Mother's dedication to these flowers, but she had never understood it until now. There was something meditative about the work, something that quieted the constant noise in her head. Out here among the roses, she could think clearly. She could remember the good times without being overwhelmed by sadness. She could talk to Alexander about his grandmother without him shutting down emotionally. As months passed, the sharp edges of grief began to soften slightly. The pain did not disappear, but it became more manageable. Alexander learned to carry it with him rather than being crushed beneath its weight. He still had hard days when missing his grandmother felt unbearable, but they came less frequently. He found ways to honor her memory that felt meaningful and genuine. He established a scholarship fund in her name, providing educational opportunities for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. He continued her tradition of weekly hospital visits, sitting with patients who had no family to comfort them. He made sure her charitable foundations were fully funded and properly managed. In every way he could think of, he tried to continue the work she had started. The public response to the Queen Mother's death had been extraordinary, but what surprised Alexander most was how it continued. 6 months after her passing, people still left flowers at the palace gates. They still wrote letters sharing memories and expressing gratitude. They still spoke of her with reverence and love. A grassroots movement began to establish a national holiday in her honor, a day of service where people would volunteer in their communities. The idea gained momentum quickly, and the government was seriously considering it. 1 year after her death, Alexander and Catherine attended a memorial service at the cathedral. Once again, the building was filled to capacity, but this time the atmosphere was different. There was still sadness, still a sense of loss, but there was also celebration. People shared stories about how the Queen Mother's example had inspired them to volunteer, to donate to charity, to be kinder to strangers. They talked about the lives she had touched and the legacy she had left behind. Alexander gave another speech, but this one was easier than the eulogy had been. He had had a year to process his grief, to understand what her loss meant and what her life had taught him. He spoke about continuing her mission of service and compassion. He talked about the scholarship recipients who were now attending university, thanks to her generosity. He shared stories that had been sent to him by people whose lives she had changed in small but significant ways. Most importantly, he spoke about the lesson that had taken him the longest to learn. Grief and love are two sides of the same coin, he said, looking out at the congregation. We grieve so deeply because we loved so completely. And that love does not end when someone dies. It transforms, but it remains. My grandmother is not here physically, but her love surrounds me every day. It is in the roses that bloom in her garden. It is in the children receiving educations they could not otherwise afford. It is in every act of kindness and service performed in her name, and it is in my heart, always. After the service, he and Catherine returned to the palace garden. It was late spring and the roses were in full bloom. They had spent the entire year caring for this garden, and it showed. The plants were healthy and vibrant, producing more flowers than they had in years. The Queen Mother would have been pleased. They walked among the roses together, holding hands, not speaking. Words were not necessary. They both understood that healing from loss is not a destination, but a journey. There would always be a part of them that missed the Queen Mother, that wished she were still here to offer advice and comfort. But they had learned to carry that loss without letting it define them. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Catherine noticed something unusual. In the center of the garden, in the spot where the Queen Mother had collapsed and died, a new rose bush had sprouted. Neither she nor Alexander had planted it. Thomas the gardener had not planted it either. It had simply appeared, as if by magic or miracle, growing from the exact place where she had taken her last breath. The bush was young but strong, with deep green leaves and tight buds that had not yet opened. Alexander knelt beside it, touching the leaves gently. Catherine knelt beside him, and together they examined this unexpected gift. "Do you think it is a sign?" Catherine asked softly. Alexander smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him in months. "I think my grandmother always loved dramatic gestures," he said. "And I think she is reminding us that life continues, that beauty can grow from loss, that we should not spend so much time mourning the past that we forget to nurture the present." They decided to leave the bush where it was, to let it grow wild and free in the center of the garden. They would water it and care for it, but they would not try to control or shape it. They would let it be itself, whatever that turned out to be. It felt like the right tribute to a woman who had always encouraged authenticity over conformity. As months and then years passed, that rose bush grew into something spectacular. It produced flowers unlike any other roses in the garden, deep red blooms with golden centers that seemed to glow in certain light. Visitors to the palace garden always commented on it, drawn to its beauty and uniqueness. Alexander and Catherine never explained its origin or significance. Some mysteries were better left unspoken. The grief never completely disappeared. There were still moments when Alexander would see something the Queen Mother would have loved, or Catherine would think of a question she wished she could ask, and the loss would feel fresh again. But those moments became less frequent and less overwhelming. The pain transformed into something softer, a sweet ache of remembrance rather than a sharp stab of despair. Alexander became the leader his grandmother had prepared him to be. He made mistakes, just as she had warned him he would, but he learned from them and kept trying. He led with compassion and served with humility. He never forgot where he came from or who had shaped him. In every decision he made, he asked himself what she would have done, what advice she would have given. Catherine grew into her role as well. She found her own voice and her own causes to champion. She visited schools and hospitals just as the Queen Mother had done. She spoke out about issues she cared about, even when it made some people uncomfortable. She stayed true to herself, while honoring the traditions and responsibilities of her position. She became exactly the kind of princess the Queen Mother had believed she could be. Together, they created a life that honored the past, while embracing the future. They established their own traditions and made their own mark on the royal family. But always, they kept the Queen Mother's memory alive. Her portrait hung in their private quarters, smiling down at them. Her favorite sayings became part of their daily vocabulary. Her example guided their choices and shaped their values. On the 5th anniversary of her death, the government officially declared a national day of service in the Queen Mother's honor. Every year on that day, millions of people across the nation would volunteer in their communities, donate to charity, or simply perform acts of kindness for strangers. It was exactly the kind of legacy she would have wanted, not monuments or statues, but living action and genuine compassion. Alexander stood in the garden that morning, surrounded by roses in full bloom. Catherine stood beside him as she always did. They were both older now, marked by grief and time, but also strengthened by it. They had survived the worst loss of their lives and had emerged with deeper wisdom and greater empathy. The Queen Mother had taught them how to live. Her death had taught them how to persevere. The sun rose over the palace, painting everything in golden light. In the center of the garden, the mysterious rosebush stood tall and proud, covered in magnificent blooms. A gentle breeze moved through the garden, carrying the sweet scent of roses and something else, something that felt almost like a presence. For just a moment, Alexander could swear he heard his grandmother's laughter on the wind, approving and joyful. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, letting the peace of the garden wash over him. When he opened his eyes again, Catherine was watching him with understanding and love. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. Alexander thought about the question, really considered it. Then he nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "I think I am. It still hurts. It probably always will. But I am okay. We are okay." Catherine squeezed his hand gently. "She would be so proud of you, of us, of everything we have built in her memory." Alexander looked around the garden at the thriving roses and the careful beauty they had created together. Then he looked at his wife, the woman who had stood beside him through the darkest days of his life. "I know," he said softly. "And that is enough. That has to be enough." They stood together in the garden as the world woke around them. Two people who had learned that love never really ends. It just changes form. The Queen Mother was gone, but she lived on in every good thing they did, every kind word they spoke, every person they helped. She lived on in the garden they tended, the scholarships they funded, the traditions they maintained. Most of all, she lived on in their hearts, a constant presence of wisdom and love that would guide them for the rest of their lives. The tears they had,